NATO troops deployed to Canada to protect Canada from America? This future isn't as far-fetched as it sounds, and it's all being made possible by the new United States of America. In 2025, the United States executed the biggest foreign policy shift in its history. After nearly a century as a founding member of NATO, the nation that once led the world's most powerful military alliance is now actively working against its own allies, and even threatening military action against two of them. No, this isn't some fantasy cooked up by Vladimir Putin, the man who has spent decades trying to undermine NATO from within, but somehow reality is aligning perfectly with Putin's ultimate goal, the end of American cooperation in the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And now, with NATO weakened, there are clear signs that Russia is watching closely, ready to exploit the chaos. How did we get here? How would NATO without the US function? And what does the future hold? NATO wasn't just the United States' idea, it was the cornerstone of a US-led global order that has been heralded as the Pax Americana. After centuries of constant warfare between major states, the NATO alliance didn't just bring old enemies together, it acted as a global bulwark against further major power wars. The age of imperialism was officially over. At its inception, NATO had three chief goals: keep the US in, keep Germany down, and keep the Soviets out. Having the US remain in the alliance was critical for its success. America was the burgeoning global superpower, and its separation from European politics gave it a neutrality of sorts for others to rally around. Keeping Germany down was all about not repeating the disastrous wars of its past. And lastly, keeping the Soviet Union out of Europe was key for regional stability and peace. The deal was good for Europe, and it was even better for the United States. Being the de facto head of the NATO alliance gave the US massive global influence. It also made it an example for other nations around the world to look to for guidance and leadership. This helped the US spread partnerships across the Middle East and Asia, bringing the world closer together and reducing the risk of a disastrous Third World War. It also massively boosted American influence, opening doors for US businesses and economic interests around the world. NATO was far from a charity case for the US. The Europeans got security, but the US got much more out of the deal. This is why the current split between the US and its European partners is all the more bewildering. In just 2 months, America has thrown away much of what it accomplished since the end of the Second World War, weakening not just itself but the world at large. A focus on America's new golden age ignores the very real decline of US prestige and influence across the globe. Perhaps the best summary comes from Iran's supreme leader, who recently reposted a 2022 tweet warning that America's treatment of Ukraine should serve as a reminder to all that Western support for countries and governments is a mirage. The US is yet to reap all that it's sown, but for the rest of NATO, the consequences are immediate and dire. First, the nation faces a Russian state that is fully mobilized for war. There's much being said about Russia's inability to win in Ukraine, but that's chiefly because of the bulk of military hardware and ammunition being used by Ukraine is supplied by the United States. In exchange, the US redirected funds originally allocated for Ukraine aid to purchase newer, more advanced weaponry for itself, using battlefield data to refine future designs and military tactics. As of March 4, 2025, all aid is officially suspended indefinitely. The loss of American aid is expected to cost the Ukrainians dearly, starting in the next 3 to 6 months when their stockpiles of American supplies run low. With Europe still struggling to mobilize its own defense industry and divided by partisan politics, Ukraine is unlikely to receive enough support to plug the hole caused by the termination of American aid. But that's only part of the picture, because a major component of US aid to Ukraine was of the silent variety that doesn't make the news, and it is just as critical. This is intelligence support, which has recently been paused. The support is absolutely critical for Ukraine's defense, and it's extremely unlikely that Europe could fill the role. This intelligence support comes largely from America's extensive network of informants and spies inside of Russia, as well as its vast intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance or ISR assets. These include everything from spy drones and AWACS aircraft monitoring Russian movements over the Black Sea to satellites tracking troop deployments and identifying targets of opportunity. Since the war began, the CIA, NRO, and US military intelligence have worked closely in coordination with Ukraine, with unacknowledged US personnel reportedly on the ground. Along the Russian-Ukrainian and Belarusian-Ukrainian borders, secret Ukrainian intelligence bases dug underground for concealment have been equipped and funded by the CIA. This too isn't charity work though, because in return Ukraine has provided critical intelligence on Russian weapon systems. As a means of showing their loyalty and trustworthiness, Ukrainian intelligence handed over design documents for Russia's newest nuclear submarines at the start of the war. Ukraine has also handed over captured Russian equipment, such as state-of-the-art electronic warfare vehicles, abandoned by Russian troops and captured intact. If the US steps out of this role, Europe isn't prepared or even capable of fully fulfilling it. NATO air warning and alert patrol missions may be flying AWACS staffed with multinational crews, but the aircraft is more often than not American. Europe also doesn't have the satellite and recon capabilities of the US, relying on intelligence sharing agreements for decades. In light of this, a US pullout would mean that Russian forces would not face nearly as many setbacks and vulnerabilities as they had while the US was still nominally in the fight. Russia may not be able to completely militarily defeat Ukraine, but it doesn't have to. A peace deal that allows Russia to retain captured territories would give it valuable time to rest, rearm, and rebuild its combat power. More importantly, it would provide the perfect staging ground for a future offensive, not just into Ukraine, but potentially beyond. And to Europe's horror, the US seems set to negotiate exactly this peace deal behind Europe's back. And in an unprecedented move, the US voted in opposition to its allies by refusing to condemn Russia for invading Ukraine in a UN vote. Furthermore, the White House has surrendered all leverage before even entering negotiations with Putin over Ukraine. It's been publicly stated that no US troops would participate in peacekeeping efforts and that the US would no longer guarantee European security. This leaves sanctions as the only remaining tool to pressure Russia, but even that may not last. There are rumors already circulating that the American president may have begun the process of removing or easing sanctions on Moscow. All of this has been portrayed as a show of good faith to get Russia to the negotiation table, but Russia has made no similar good faith concessions. Whatever the reasoning for Washington giving Russia everything it wants with nothing in return, the message to NATO is clear. The US is no longer a reliable partner. Then it comes to the trade wars and military threats against its allies. On March 4, 2025, the US imposed 25% tariffs on Mexico and Canada with a promise that tariffs against the EU are to follow soon. Retaliatory tariffs are set to drive up inflation significantly in the US and directly impact hundreds of thousands of jobs who rely on overseas trade. More disturbing, though, are the flat-out refusals by the White House to walk back statements that it was considering military action against Greenland and Panama after openly expressing desires for both to become American territories. This is especially alarming, given that Greenland is administered by Denmark, one of America's longest-standing allies and a founding member of NATO. If the US were to pursue military action, it would mean sending American troops into combat against a treaty ally, directly undermining NATO itself. And technically, by the terms of the NATO treaty, trigger an Article 5 response against the United States. Once more, we have to remind you that this isn't Vladimir Putin's fantasy, it's our present reality. So what can NATO do in a future without the US as a reliable ally, and even worse, with the US as a threat? First, steps are already being taken to make Europe security independent from the United States. It's true that Europe has freeloaded a lot of its security off of US taxpayers, but this would also be ignoring the reality that American politicians themselves have purposefully manipulated Europe into being security dependent on the US. The US has historically supported European leaders who didn't push for full military independence, ensuring that America remained the primary guarantor of European security. This arrangement not only reinforced US global prestige, but also provided significant economic and soft power advantages. Simply put, it's been a very good deal for the US until now. Germany and France have announced a need for Europe to distance itself from the new America, and along with many European countries, they're already looking to do that by divesting themselves of US defense contractors. At the moment, the US is the world's largest arms dealer, with American weapons being a cornerstone of NATO arsenals. This makes it extremely interoperable, adding to its lethality. NATO's fleet of F-35s is designed to seamlessly communicate with one another. Additionally, a shared familiarity with various weapon systems, training protocols, and logistics ensures that NATO armies can work together more effectively on the battlefield. But this also makes Europe extremely vulnerable against an increasingly hostile America. A big fear in every European military planner's mind is what will happen if the White House decides to cut off software upgrades for the F-35, for example. America can't simply take the weapons it has sold back, at least probably not without having to face those same weapons in combat. But what it can do is turn off logistical support entirely. No more updates, no more repairs, making a very expensive weapon system practically useless for European nations. This is why Europe has been driving ever harder to establish next-generation weapons programs independently of the US. Currently, there are two major sixth-generation fighter programs running inside of Europe. The first is a joint venture between France, Germany, and Spain, known as the Future Combat Air System. The other is a program between UK, Italy, and Japan, known as the Global Combat Air System, or GCAP. The American defense industry is a global leader, but that is a position only made possible by their access to huge overseas markets. Without hundreds of billions in defense contracts from allied militaries, the US defense industry would face severe downsizing. A lack of foreign sales would lead to reduced production capacity, fewer technological advancements, and shrinking research budgets. Over time, this decline could make the American defense sector less competitive, eventually allowing global rivals to surpass the US military technology and manufacturing dominance. This is not a good start to an American golden age. Europe can also strike back at American weapons programs by withholding components or participation in manufacturing. The F-35 is famously an American aircraft, but an international project. The UK and Italy, for example, provide critical components and assist in manufacturing. The Netherlands provides parts for the fuselage, and Norway and Australia who build engine components. The jet simply cannot be built without America's global partners. With the F-35 increasingly making up America's air fleets, the US might find itself in a future where it's unable to fly its own planes due to a lack of repair capabilities and replacement production. The biggest blow to the United States, though, is also a step that's already under consideration by European powers: removing US access to their military bases. As the United States increasingly aligns itself, countries across Europe are becoming increasingly fearful of what it might mean if the next war involves the United States on Russia's side. It's not as crazy a scenario as it appears on the face of it. The new White House has already expressed ambitions of seizing territory held by allies. With the US shifting toward a purely transactional geopolitical model, there's every reason to worry that American troops could be used to seize key strategic hubs inside of Europe, forcing allied nations into unfavorable concessions. Germany hosts nearly 35,000 American soldiers, along with one of the US's largest air bases anywhere outside of its own borders. From this position, the US could rapidly project land and air power all across Germany, effectively neutralizing the German military's ability to defend its own territory while holding key strategic locations hostage. It's a genuine fear expressed by many Europeans today. This means that increasingly, Europeans are eyeing US presence on their soil warily, conscious of how even a small toehold could be exploited by the US's vast expeditionary capabilities. We could very well soon see the end of a US presence in Europe, and this would be disastrous for the United States as well. Europe serves as the gateway for the US military into the Middle East and Africa, allowing the US to support far-flung military campaigns all the way into Iraq and Afghanistan. It was the European-American military bases that were the key nodes in the logistical chain linking US troops back home to the mainland. Losing Europe would be America's largest geopolitical disaster in its history, compounding a growing list of foreign policy setbacks and disasters. Europe is now scrambling to redefine NATO without the United States, unsure of what the alliance looks like or how it functions without its longtime leader. Meanwhile, the US is blindly walking into a self-made disaster, a future where it has no allies, no global reach, no reliable partners, and zero trust left in its promises or guarantees. Is NATO strong enough to survive without US support? Or is this the beginning of the end for the alliance? How will Europe respond to this massive shift in global power? Drop your thoughts below. Now go check out what would happen if Canada became the 51st state, or click this other video instead.